Hey, welcome back to Entraz. Today we're going to be looking at installing ESXi 7.0 on a supermicro, I guess you would call it a thin twin. It's a one rack unit box, but it actually has two servers built into it. As you see from this video, we have a single RU server attached to a Cisco 3560CX switch, which will allow us to do our layer 3 and layer 2 routing here. As well as my laptop. This is going to be the configuration we're going to be going through for this ESXi installation. You might notice from the pictures though, we only have 2 hard drives per server and a single power supply, so it's not really meant for production use, but it makes a really good lab unit. I think you can still pick up some of these things on eBay, but we'll turn this on and we'll get started. So I have one of my machines currently connected, but I need to download and burn ESXi 7. So let's do that really quick. Let me open up this here, VMware ESXi download. Okay, scroll past the ads. There we go. Okay, let me log in here. Now, I believe you can create a login for free, and then you can get a license and download for the vSphere Hypervisor 7. Hypervisor 7, it's currently update 2A. I'm not really sure why it wants me to register, but let me see if we can download this. Well, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Product download. ESXi 7.0 Update 3, 3A, 3B, and vCenter 3B are no longer available due to critical issues. Interesting. Anyway, let's come over here and look at Hypervisor 7.0 2A. Let's download the ISO image. Wants me to log in again. I'll agree. Accept, and we start the download. So once we download the ISO, we need to burn this image to a recordable disk, which you see I'm doing now. I do have an external Blu-ray writer, so I'll be able to put this disk directly into the supermicro once we're ready to do the install. As I said, when burning the disk, it's not that large, it's only about 390 megs, so the download and the burn should be quite quick and easy. And hopefully with this old system we won't have any problems with my my StarTech KVM over here. But hey, we'll see how it goes. Alright, now that I have this burned, I'm going to close all this down because we shouldn't need it anymore, and we'll bring up the crash card. Alright, I'm going to turn on the server. You'll probably hear how loud it is. And like I said, I'll probably mute the timeline during the really loud parts. Now we'll see how it goes. So we're connecting server 2 actually right now. Start it up. And there's our jet plane booting up. So the rest of this, or at least until it quiets down, if it quiets down, we'll mute the timeline. So bear with me. So I had to re-record narration because the server noise lasted throughout pretty much the entire video. It was really bad, as you just heard. But here we go. You see here on the supermicro we have setup boot from network and BBS pop-ups. Let's see, we have Intel Xeon X5675 3 GHz processors. There are 2 of them. I believe these are 6-core processors, so 12 cores each at 3 GHz apiece. At this time the servers got a lot quieter, but we're still annoying. So as I said, I redid the narration here. We're going to start off on the new one, the ESXi 7 installer, which we're going to hit OK on. One of the nice things about ESXi is you do have the ability to install on an SD card or a USB drive. However, I am out of USB ports, as you might have seen from the pictures. I only have 2 USB ports on here. So we installed the local 1TB SSD drive for the ESXi install and for the virtual machine storage. Looking at the supermicro servers, I only have 2 USB ports. I'm using one of them for my KVM device, which shows you on screen. And the other is for my Blu-ray drive that I'm using to install ESXi on. One of the things you can do, however, is install ESXi on a different machine and then boot it on here. I haven't really tried this on the system, but with a couple of Intel nukes I have, they work just fine. Maybe we'll look at doing that as well. Keep in mind, these systems are really old. As I said, these are the X series Intel processors. Not even the version 1 or higher, or not even the newer Intels. So you'll notice the new Intels come in like gold and silver and bronze and whatnot. Those are the newest versions of the Intel Xeon. Hopefully we won't have any problems. As I said, 6 cores times 2s, 12 cores plus hyperthreading, 3 GHz apiece. That's pretty good. Though we do have SSD as our storage, so we shouldn't have any problems with speed and throughput accessing the install and our VMs. We're going to go through this installation here. I will be doing the same on the second server as well. I'm not going to show that in video because it's pretty much the same thing. After the ESXi servers have been installed, we need to move forward with an Active Directory domain controller that will also be hosting DNS. Because vCenter server really requires DNS, and we'll show you that to you in probably the 3rd or 4th video here when we get into vCenter. I don't know if you saw my video on Hyper-V clustering and System Center Virtual Machine Manager, but you'll see that VMware's process is so much simpler and it works really well. Hyper-V and SCVMM were really very painful. We shall see the differences between Hyper-V on how the virtual switches, the storage, clustering, and net teaming are configured, though in the end you'll wonder why we even bother to use Hyper-V since it is so difficult to use. The only reason I'd say to use Hyper-V is because we do have the ability to run a free hypervisor in a cluster without requiring something like System Center Virtual Machine Manager. So like, yeah, in VMware you can't cluster without vCenter server, and this is all kind of a huge cost. A vCenter server alone is somewhere in the range of $8,000, and then each ESXi host is upwards of $1,400 a piece, so getting that cluster is a huge startup cost right away. With Hyper-V, you don't need any of that. You can cluster to Windows Server 19 servers or 22 servers, and you'll be good to go. Keep in mind, with Hyper-V, you do have to license per VM. So you may want to license, say, 16 cores, and standard will give you the ability to run 2 VMs. I'm not really sure how this works when talking about Linux. Windows does mention something about virtual environments, but like with VMware, you don't have to license your virtual machines in VMware. You can run as many Linux boxes as you want, and then you have to license for Windows Server. So what I do is I typically have Linux boxes running on my Hyper-V hosts, but I wouldn't think of licensing them because even though they are virtual, they're not running Windows. And that's one of the reasons Windows and Microsoft came out with the AVMA keys, or it might be the Automatic Virtual Machine Authorization keys. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but for now, I typically just run Linux VMs on Hyper-V, even if they're not quote-unquote licensed because they're not Windows. I did, however, purchase the Data Center Edition of Server 2019, so I can pretty much run unlimited VMs, so not something I really have to worry about. At some point here, we're going to see that apparently ESXi 7.0 doesn't support the network cards I have in the server, so we'll have to try a different version. So we'll come through here, we'll hit F11, cancel the install, and I'm going to pause the video for a little bit and go get 6.7. Alright, so I went back and downloaded 6.7, burned it to a disk, and now we're at the same point we were on 7. You'll see here now that we don't have the network card issue, but we can choose where to install ESXi. This will be that 1 terabyte SSD I told you about earlier. It will then ask me to verify this because it will destroy all data on these drives. Now we start to configure ESXi. We can specify the keyboard layout, a password for the root account, and it will tell us that this processor will most likely not be supported in the future releases. Funny thing, considering it was the network cards that prevented us from installing 7.0. Once we're ready, we can hit F11 to continue the install. Now we wait for the installation to complete. Once the install is done, we remove the media and reboot the server. We'll go through the boot process of VMware and end up at the console for ESXi. I'm going to break pause, install the other ESXi server, and then we can come back and view the initial configuration of ESXi. Alright, now that we're up and running on both servers, we have our little splash screen here. Basically the initial console screen that allows us to configure the server. You see here our management addressing. Without DHCP or static IP, you'll get an APIPA address for IPv4 and the link local for IPv6. Pressing F2, we can customize our system and view logs. F12 allows us to do reboots and shutdowns from the local console. Let's configure the server by pressing F2 and then entering that username and password recreated earlier. In the system customization, we have these options. Configure password for the root account, configure lockdown mode, configure management network, restart management network, test management network, network restore options, configure keyboard, troubleshooting options, view system logs, view system information, and reset system configuration. At this point, we want to configure the management network, so we can choose which network adapters are included. In this first option here, we can specify team membership. So we select both NICs, which allows us to do load balancing and redundancy/failover. Clicking on this, we see all of our recognized network adapters labeled as VMNIC 0 and VMNIC 1. We also have the MAC address of each device as well as their status, which are both connected. I'm going to select both NIC to create a team for this vSwitch/port group. Next, we can configure the management access VM kernel port with a VLAN. If we are doing trunking from our switch, which allows multiple VLANs rather than doing a single static VLAN, once again depending on how we're connecting this into our network. If these VMNICs have a dedicated uplink, typically we would be able to do a static VLAN instead of doing trunks. However, as I mentioned, this server only has 2 network cards, so we're going to have to do a little shared management between the VMNICs and the VM kernels. So now that we've looked at that, let's go into our switch that connects to our servers. It has been pre-configured a little bit, so we'll just go through it. The show VLAN command will list out our VLANs that are configured. Show IP interfaces brief pipe exclude unassigned will list the IP addresses that are assigned to the ports and VLANs. We do see that VLANs 10, 30, 90, and 100 do have IP addresses on them. If we do the show ARP VLAN 10, this will show us if there's any devices with IP to MAC addresses in that ARP table that are communicating on this routed switch. Keep in mind, this is not a great way to select IP addresses for new servers or computers, as there can be any number of machines that are offline, haven't talked in a while, just aren't listed in the ARP table. So an IPAM solution for IP address management would be a great idea. So since we are using VLAN 10 for management, let's specify VLAN 10 as the VLAN for management VM kernel port in ESXi. We next need to configure the IPv4 configuration, once again being in that VLAN 10 and in that network. You can disable IPv4 address or use DHCP, which is of course the default. However, we will be setting a static IPv4 address and network configuration to apply this IPv4 address. As we are currently configuring our server number 2, let's give an IP address of 10.0.10.21 with a subnet mask of /24 or 255.255.255.0 and a gateway of 10.0.10.1 as we saw previously looking at our switch, which this IPv4 address is configured on VLAN 10. We also need to be aware of the DNS configuration for name to IP address resolution as well as DNS suffix search list. We don't have a domain controller set up yet, though we will be doing that once our servers are up and running. We'll show this in a second video. Once done, we can hit escape. A pop-up will ask us if we want to restart the management network. Keep in mind, if you make any changes to the network, you do need to restart it for it to apply.